In the dust of southern Iraq, beneath layers of forgotten empires, clay tablets have waited for over 4,000 years to share their secrets. Among them lies a fragmentary text, the Adapa myth, a story that scholars believe contains one of humanity's oldest accounts of forbidden knowledge. The god Enki, lord of wisdom and the underground waters, chose a mortal man named Adapa to receive teachings so powerful that heaven itself took notice. But what did Enki actually teach him? The answers, scattered across museums from London to Philadelphia, have only recently been pieced together. Tonight, as the ancient words unfold, you will discover what Enki whispered to Adapa in the sacred city of Eridu, at the edge of the world's first civilization. In the ancient world, there existed a land that would become the cradle of human civilization. A place where two great rivers descended from the mountains of the north and wound their way through vast plains before emptying into the sea. And this land the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, was home to some of the earliest cities, the first writing, the first codified laws, and the first stories that humanity would tell about itself and its gods. The Tigris and the Euphrates, these twin arteries of life, carried snowmelt from the highlands of Anatolia down through what is now Iraq, and where they approached the Persian Gulf. They slowed and spread into a vast network of marshes and wetlands, a labyrinth of waterways where reeds grew taller than men, and fish swam in waters so abundant that they seemed inexhaustible. This was the world of ancient Sumer. And to understand the story of Enki and Adapa, we must first immerse ourselves in this landscape. For the Sumerians did not separate their gods from the world around them, and every element of their environment carried sacred meaning. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of these marshes some 5,000 years ago, before the rise of Babylon, before Assyria spread its empire across the ancient world, in a time when the cities of Sumer were young and their temples rose fresh from the earth. The air is thick with moisture and the smell of growing things, of water plants and mud, and the sweet decay of organic matter returning to the cycle of life. Ahead of you stretches an endless maze of channels and islands where fishermen pole their reed boats through shallow waters and gatherers harvest the tall reeds that grow everywhere in profusion. The sun beats down with fierce intensity, for this is a land of extremes where summer temperatures can reach unbearable heights and where the rivers, fed by distant rains, can rise without warning and flood the lowlands. Yet, for all its harshness, this landscape provided everything the early Sumerians needed to build their world. The reeds that grew in such abundance became the raw material for houses and boats and baskets and mats, bundled and woven into structures of surprising strength and beauty. The clay that lined the riverbanks and marshes could be shaped into bricks for building, into tablets for writing, into vessels for storing grain and oil and beer. The date palm, that most generous of trees, provided fruit for eating, fronds for weaving, wood for construction, and shade from the relentless sun. And the water itself, the water was everything, the source of life in a region where rain was scarce and unpredictable, where the difference between abundance and famine often depended on the rise and fall of the rivers. At the southern edge of this watery world, where the marshes gave way to the sea, there stood a city that the Sumerians believed was the oldest in the world, the first settlement where humans had gathered to live in community under the guidance of the gods. This was Eridu, and archaeological excavations at its site have revealed a remarkable sequence of temples built one atop another over thousands of years, each new structure preserving and honoring what came before, creating a layered record of continuous worship stretching back to the very beginnings of Mesopotamian civilization. The earliest levels show simple shrines, modest structures where offerings of fish were left for the deity who dwelt there. And as the centuries passed, these shrines grew larger and more elaborate, evolving into the great temple platforms that would become the ziggurats of later Mesopotamian religion. What makes Eridu significant for our story is that this was the sacred city of Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water. And the Sumerians believed that Eridu was the place where civilization itself began, where the arts of human culture first descended from the heavens to the earth. Here at the edge of the marshes, where fresh water welled up from underground springs to mingle with the waters of the rivers and the sea, the god of the deep had made his home, and from here he would reach out to touch human lives with the gift of knowledge. The Sumerians, like all ancient peoples, understood their world through the lens of divine presence, and their gods were not distant abstractions, but living powers intimately connected to the forces of nature and civilization. At the head of their pantheon stood An, whose name simply means sky or heaven, the remote father god who dwelt in the highest reaches of the cosmos and who had in the earliest times been supreme among the gods before ceding much of his active authority to younger deities, and represented the overarching dome of the heavens, the vast blue expanse by day and the star-filled darkness by night. And while he retained his position of honor, he had become a somewhat passive figure, the elder statesman of the divine assembly rather than its active ruler. Below An in the hierarchy, and far more active in the affairs of both gods and humans, stood Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Air or Lord of the Wind, and Enlil was the executive power of the pantheon, the god who carried out the decrees of fate and who commanded the obedience of the other gods. Enlil was associated with the atmosphere, with the space between heaven and earth where weather happened, and his character was stern and authoritative, concerned with the proper ordering of the cosmos, and sometimes harsh in his dealings with humanity. It was Enlil who sent the great flood to destroy humankind in Mesopotamian tradition, Enlil who grew weary of human noise and disturbance and decreed their annihilation. And then there was Enki, the third of the great gods, and Enki was something altogether different. Where An was remote and Enlil was stern, Enki was intimate and clever, a god who genuinely loved humanity and who used his considerable intelligence to help them even when it meant circumventing the decrees of his fellow gods. Enki was the god of sweet water, of the underground freshwater ocean called the Abzu, that the Mesopotamians believed existed beneath the surface of the earth, feeding the springs and rivers that made life possible. But Enki was also the god of wisdom, of magic, of craftsmanship, of all the arts and sciences that raised humanity above mere animal existence. The Sumerians organized their understanding of civilization around a concept called the me, and a word that is difficult to translate precisely, but that refers to the divine powers or decrees that made every aspect of civilized life possible. The me were not abstract principles, but were thought of almost as objects, as discrete packages of divine power that could be held, transferred, or even stolen. There were me for kingship, and me for priesthood, me for the scribal art, and me for the craft of the carpenter, me for sexual intercourse, and me for the making of beer, me for truth, and me for the descent into the underworld. These me, numbering in the hundreds, together comprised everything that made civilization work, and in Sumerian tradition, it was Enki who possessed and guarded the me, keeping them in his temple at Eridu in the depths of the Abzu. One famous myth tells how the goddess Inanna visited Enki at Eridu, and, plying him with beer until he grew generous in his cups, persuaded him to give her the me one by one, which she then carried away to her own city of Uruk. When Enki sobered up and realized what he had done, he sent his servants to retrieve the me. But Inanna had already reached her city, and the transfer was complete. This story, amusing as it is, reveals something important about Enki's character. He was the god who held the powers of civilization, but he was also a god who could be persuaded to share them, a god whose fundamental impulse was to give rather than to hoard. The temple where Enki dwelt was called the Abzu, which means House of the Abzu, or House of the Deep Water, and it stood at Eridu as the earthly counterpart to Enki's cosmic domain. Temples in Mesopotamia were not primarily places where ordinary people came to worship, as churches or mosques function today, but were understood as the literal dwelling places of the gods, houses where divine beings lived and where they were cared for by their servants, the priests. The god was present in the temple in the form of a cult statue, a figure crafted with sacred rituals that invited the deity to take up residence within it. And this statue was treated as a living being, washed and dressed and fed each day with offerings of food and drink. The temple was also a point of connection between the human and divine realms, a place where the vertical axis of the cosmos, from the underworld through the earth to the heavens, was accessible to those who knew the proper rites. For Enki's temple, this connection was particularly significant because his domain was the Abzu, the waters beneath the earth. And so the Abzu was understood as sitting directly above the cosmic deep, a place where the sweet waters welled up from below and where access to Enki's realm was most immediate. It was in this context that Enki would choose a human being to receive his teachings, and to understand why Enki would do such a thing, we must appreciate what made him different from the other great gods. In the Mesopotamian flood story, when Enlil decreed that humanity should be destroyed by a great deluge, it was Enki who found a way to save humankind by warning the sage Ziusudra to build a boat and preserve the seed of life. Enki did not openly defy Enlil, for even he was bound by the decrees of the divine assembly. But he found a clever loophole, speaking not to Ziusudra directly, but to the reed wall of his house, me knowing that the sage would overhear and understand. This combination of genuine care for humanity and crafty intelligence is the essence of Enki's character, and it explains why he would be the god to grant forbidden knowledge to a mortal. In another myth, Enki and Ninhursag, we see Enki in the paradise land of Dilmun, a pure and pristine place where there is no sickness or death, and even here, Enki cannot resist exploring and creating, eating the forbidden plants that Ninhursag has grown, and thereby bringing trouble upon himself. Enki is restless, curious, always pushing boundaries, and this quality that sometimes gets him into difficulty is also what makes him the great benefactor of humankind. In the myth called Enki and the World Order, we see the god traveling throughout the known world, organizing and blessing each region, assigning the gods their duties, establishing the proper functioning of rivers and fields and cities and nations. Enki is the divine craftsman, the one who takes raw material and shapes it into something useful and good. And this creative, organizing impulse extends to his relationship with humans. He wants to see them flourish, wants to equip them with the knowledge they need to build civilizations and live meaningful lives. This is the god who would come to Adapa in the city of Eridu, who would look upon a mortal priest and see something worth cultivating, worth teaching, worth raising up toward the divine. And so, before we can tell the story of what Enki taught Adapa in secret, we must hold in our minds this image of the god, clever and kind, powerful yet approachable, keeper of the waters and guardian of wisdom. The one deity in all the Sumerian pantheon most likely to reach across the boundary between divine and human, and offer something precious to one he considered worthy. In the chapters that follow, we will see how Enki chose his student, what gifts he bestowed, and what consequences followed when heaven itself took notice of a mortal man who knew too much. But for now, let us rest here at the edge of the marshes, in the shadow of the great temple, where the sweet waters rise from the deep, and where the oldest stories of humanity were first written in clay, and remembered in the hearts of those who told them to their children, generation after generation, until they came at last to us across the vast gulf of time. In Eridu, where the sweet water welled up from the deep, there lived a man whom Enki had made perfect in wisdom, and his name was Adapa, the first and greatest of the sages, the seed of mankind as the ancient texts would call him. And to understand what Enki taught him in secret, we must first understand who Adapa was and what his life looked like in that sacred city at the edge of the marshlands, where reeds bent in the salt wind and the temples rose white against the endless blue of the Mesopotamian sky. Adapa was no ordinary man, for he had been fashioned by Enki himself to serve as the model of what humanity could become when touched by divine knowledge. And each day before the sun rose over the palm groves, he would wake in the silence of the pre-dawn hours, when the stars still burned bright above the ziggurat, and he would begin the rituals that maintained the sacred order of the world. His hands knew the feel of grain as he ground the flour for the temple offerings, and his voice knew the ancient words that must be spoken as the bread was shaped and placed in the ovens, and his feet knew the worn stones of the temple courtyard where he had walked since childhood, learning the ways of the priests who served the Lord of the sweet waters. In the Mesopotamian tradition, there existed a belief in beings called the Apkallu, the 7 sages who were sent by the gods in the time before the Great Flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization. And Adapa stood at the head of this lineage, the first of these primordial wise men who carried divine knowledge in mortal form, and everything that would come after in the long history of human wisdom traced its roots back to what he learned in the temple of Eridu. His duties were many and varied. For a sage of his standing was not merely a priest, but a keeper of all sacred knowledge. And so Adapa would tend to the baking of the ceremonial bread, and he would go out upon the waters of the Persian Gulf in his small boat to catch the fish needed for the temple offerings. And he would read the signs written in the livers of sacrificed animals, and he would watch the movements of the stars and planets across the night sky, recording their positions in the wet clay that would preserve his observations for generations yet unborn. Picture him, if you will, rising in the darkness while the city still sleeps, and walking through streets lit only by oil lamps, flickering in doorways and entering the temple precinct where the air smells of incense and the old stone holds the coolness of the night, and beginning the work that connects the human world to the divine, as it has been done since the first temple was built upon this very spot in the time when Eridu was the only city and all the world beyond was wilderness and water. This was Adapa, the sage of Eridu, the one whom Enki chose to receive the gift of wide understanding, and his story begins in earnest with that gift, and what it meant for a mortal man to carry the knowledge of the gods within his fragile human mind. Enki, lord of the Abzu, the underground ocean of fresh water that fed the springs and rivers of the world, looked upon Adapa with a love that crossed the boundary between divine and mortal, and he decided to give this man something unprecedented, something that had never been given to a human being before. The tablets tell us in their ancient Akkadian script that Enki gave Adapa wide understanding, making him wise, and that he revealed to him the design of heaven and earth. And these phrases, which may seem simple enough, contain depths of meaning that the priests of Babylon spent their entire lives trying to fathom. Wide understanding in the Akkadian language was Uznu Rapashtu, and it meant not merely intelligence or learning, but a kind of cosmic perception that allowed one to see the hidden connections between all things, and to understand why the world works as it does, and to perceive the will of the gods in the patterns of nature and human affairs. To have the design of heaven and earth revealed meant that Adapa understood the structure of the cosmos itself, the way the three great realms of sky and earth and underground water fit together in an eternal dance, and how the gods maintained this structure through their divine powers, and what role humanity played in the grand order of existence. Enki taught Adapa the arts of divination so that he could read the future in the entrails of animals, and in the patterns of oil on water, and in the movements of birds across the sky, and in the strange events that might occur in daily life. For all of these were messages from the gods to those who had eyes to see, and Enki gave Adapa those eyes. He taught him the words of power, the incantations that could heal the sick and protect the vulnerable and bind evil spirits. And these were not mere superstitions, but technologies of the sacred, a way of manipulating the fundamental forces of reality through precise combinations of sound and gesture and intent that Enki himself had designed when he first established the order of the world. He taught him the calendar and the proper times for all things, for planting and harvesting, and marriage and war and festival and mourning. Because the Mesopotamians knew that time was not uniform, but textured with divine presence, more concentrated at some moments than others, and to know the calendar was to know when the gods were listening and when they might be persuaded. All of this and more Enki poured into the mind of Adapa, until this mortal man possessed a knowledge that rivaled the gods themselves. And yet there was one thing that Enki did not give him, and this is the great mystery at the heart of our story. Enki gave Adapa wisdom without immortality knowledge, without eternal life. And the texts are quite explicit about this, that Enki made Adapa wise, but did not give him the gift of living forever. And we must ask ourselves, Why would a god who loved this man, who chose him above all others, who taught him the secrets of the universe itself, withhold this one final gift? Perhaps Enki knew that immortality would be a burden rather than a blessing, for what would it mean to live forever with the knowledge of all things, watching civilizations rise and fall, watching everyone you love grow old and die while you remained unchanging? Perhaps Enki understood that mortality is not the opposite of wisdom, but somehow essential to it, that it is only because we die that our choices matter and our loves are precious, and our brief, bright days upon the earth have meaning. Perhaps Enki was bound by laws even he could not break, for the gods of Mesopotamia were not omnipotent, and even Enki, the cleverest of them all, had to work within limits set by forces older and greater than himself. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that haunts the myth most deeply, Enki had reasons we cannot fathom, and like any great teacher, he gave his student what he needed, rather than what he might have wanted. For years, this arrangement held, and Adapa served the temple and practiced his sacred arts, and the knowledge Enki had given him bore fruit in the flourishing of Eridu, and the order of the world was maintained by the rituals performed correctly, and the calendar observed, and the divine will interpreted truly. And if Adapa sometimes wondered why he must grow old and die like other men while carrying knowledge fit for gods, he kept such thoughts to himself and continued his work. Then came the day when everything changed, and this is where the story takes its fateful turn toward the event that would summon Adapa to heaven itself. It was a day like any other, when Adapa went down to the shore of the Persian Gulf to fish in the sacred waters, and the morning was calm, and the sea was smooth as polished bronze, and he pushed his small reed boat out through the shallows and began to paddle toward the deeper waters where the fish gathered in schools beneath the surface. The sun rose higher, and the heat of the Mesopotamian summer pressed down upon him, and still he fished, drawing up his nets, heavy with the silver bodies that would feed the temple and honor the gods. And if his thoughts wandered to the mysteries he had learned, or the brevity of human life beneath the eternal sky, no record remains to tell us. Then, without warning, the south wind rose from the waters and struck his boat with sudden violence, and the vessel capsized, throwing Adapa into the sea, where he struggled against the waves, and the wind that seemed determined to drown him there in the very waters where he had fished since childhood. Adapa called out in his anger and fear, and the words that came from his mouth were not ordinary words, but words of power, the incantations Enki had taught him. And he cursed the south wind with a curse so potent that it broke the wing of the wind itself, and the south wind fell silent and ceased to blow. For 7 days the wind did not stir, and the sails of boats hung slack upon the water, and the air grew still and heavy over all the land. And the gods in heaven looked down and wondered what had happened to disturb the order they had established. Anu, the Sky Father, the king of the gods, noticed that the south wind had not blown for 7 days, and he made inquiry among the divine beings, asking who or what could have done this thing. And word came back to him that a mortal man named Adapa, priest of Eridu, had spoken words of power and broken the wing of the wind. Anu was astonished that a human being could possess such power, and he was troubled by what this might mean for the order of heaven and earth. And he sent his messenger down to the city of Eridu with a summons commanding Adapa to appear before the throne of heaven to answer for what he had done. When Adapa received this summons, his heart must have trembled within him, for no mortal had ever been called to stand before Anu in the celestial court and to face the king of all the gods was a prospect that would terrify even the wisest of men. But Adapa was not alone, for Enki, his teacher and protector, knew what had happened and came to prepare him for the journey. Enki spoke to Adapa with the care of a father sending his son into danger and told him exactly how he must behave when he reached the court of heaven, and every word of this advice would prove crucial to what followed, though not in the way either teacher or student could have foreseen. First, Enki told him how to dress, saying that he must put on garments of mourning and not anoint himself with oil, so that he would appear shabby and grief-stricken rather than proud and well-appointed. And this strange advice had a purpose, for at the gate of heaven he would meet two gods who might be persuaded to help him if he seemed humble and sorrowful. At the gate, Adapa would find Dumuzi and Gizida, two gods who had themselves known suffering and death and exile from heaven. And when they asked why he appeared in mourning, he should say that he grieved because two gods had vanished from the earth speaking their names, and by this flattery and this show of piety he might win their favor. Then Enki gave him the most crucial instruction of all, warning him that when he stood before Anu, the Sky Father would offer him food and drink, but that he must refuse both, no matter how they were presented for. Enki said, "They will offer you the bread of death and the water of death, and if you eat and drink of them, you will surely die." This warning made sense to Adapa, for he knew that the food of the gods was not meant for mortal consumption, and that many stories told of humans who had died from eating divine food or drinking divine drink, and he resolved to follow his teacher's instructions exactly, no matter what temptations might be placed before him. And so Adapa began his journey to heaven, traveling upward through the celestial realms by paths that no mortal foot had ever walked, and the air grew thin and cold, and the stars wheeled around him in patterns he recognized from his studies, though he had never thought to see them so close. And at last, he came to the great gate that marked the entrance to the court of Anu. There at the gate, as Enki had foretold, stood Dumuzi and Gizida, the divine guardians who examined all who sought to enter, and they looked upon this mortal man in his shabby mourning clothes, and they asked him, "Why do you appear thus ragged and sorrowful? And where do you come from? And why have you been summoned to this place?" None Adapa answered exactly as Enki had taught him, saying that he came from Eridu from the earth below, and that he wore mourning because two gods had vanished from his land, speaking the names of Dumuzi and Gizida, as though in grief for their absence. And this flattery touched the hearts of the two gods who had indeed known exile and suffering. Dumuzi and Gizida were moved by what seemed like genuine piety and devotion, and they decided to help this strange mortal who alone among all humanity had come to mourn their absence from the earth, and they promised to speak well of him before Anu, and to try to soften whatever judgment the Sky Father might render. And so Adapa passed through the gate of heaven, escorted by these two divine allies, and he walked the roads of the celestial realm until he came to the great hall where Anu sat upon his throne surrounded by all the glory of divine kingship. And there, for the first time in the history of the world, a mortal man stood face to face with the supreme God. Anu looked upon Adapa with eyes that had watched the universe unfold since before the earth was formed. And he saw this small mortal creature standing before him, unafraid and clothed in mourning. And he asked the question that would determine everything that followed. "How is it," Anu asked, "that a human being has broken the wing of the south wind? And what manner of man possesses such power that he can curse the winds themselves and disrupt the order of heaven and earth?" And here, Dumuzi and Gizida spoke up on Adapa's behalf, telling Anu that this was Adapa, the sage of Eridu, the priest of Enki, who had been given wide understanding and who served the gods faithfully, and that the breaking of the south wind, though certainly a disruption, was not done with malice, but in fear and anger when the wind tried to drown him. Anu listened to these words, and something shifted in his countenance, for he had expected perhaps to find an arrogant rebel who had deliberately defied heaven. And instead, he found a terrified but dignified mortal who had acted in self-preservation with powers he barely understood. And then a strange thing happened, for Anu began to laugh. Not cruelly, but with genuine amusement at the predicament before him. For here was a human being who possessed the knowledge of the gods, and yet was still mortal. And what was heaven to do with such a creature? Punish him for being what Enki had made him, or honor him for his wisdom, or perhaps something else entirely? The mood in the great hall shifted from judgment to something more like curiosity and wonder. And Anu made a decision that changed everything, commanding his servants to bring forth the bread of life and the water of life, and to offer them to Adapa as a gift that would make him immortal. Imagine the moment when the divine servants placed before Adapa a golden vessel containing bread, unlike any bread that mortal hands had ever baked, and a cup containing water from the springs of eternal life, and told him that by the command of the King of Heaven, he was being offered the gift that humans had dreamed of since the beginning of time. Adapa looked at the bread and the water, and he remembered what Enki had told him. "They will offer you the bread of death and the water of death, and if you eat and drink of them, you will surely die." And he did what his teacher had commanded him to do, and refused to eat or drink. "No," Adapa said to the servants of heaven, "I will not eat this bread, and I will not drink this water for my Lord. Enki has warned me that they will bring death, and I choose to obey my teacher rather than accept the hospitality of heaven." A profound silence fell over the court as the implications of what had just happened became clear to all present, and Anu looked down at this mortal man who had just refused immortality out of loyalty to his teacher, and the Sky Father's face showed something very like sadness. "Why," Anu asked, "did you not eat the bread and drink the water? For they were the bread of life and the water of life, and if you had consumed them, you would have become like us and lived forever. And now you have refused, and it cannot be offered again." Adapa stood frozen as the truth of what he had done washed over him like cold water, and he understood at last that Enki had either lied to him or made a terrible mistake, or perhaps, and this is the deepest mystery, deliberately ensured that his student would remain mortal. The texts give us no clear answer to the question that must burn in every reader's mind, for they do not tell us whether Enki knew what would happen, or whether he truly believed the food and drink would bring death, or whether there was some other reason hidden in the depths of divine wisdom that we cannot fathom. What we do know is that Adapa refused the only chance any human would ever be given to become immortal, and that he did so out of trust in his teacher, and that this trust, whether well placed or betrayed, would define his fate, and through him, the fate of all humanity who would follow. Anu did not punish Adapa for breaking the wing of the south wind, for what punishment could compare to what had already been lost, and instead, he sent the sage back to earth with honors and acknowledgements of his wisdom, but without the gift that would have made that wisdom eternal. And so, Adapa descended from heaven and returned to Eridu and to his temple duties and to his life, which would now continue as all mortal lives continue toward an end that even his vast knowledge could not prevent. The bread he baked for the temple offerings would be eaten and forgotten, and the fish he caught in the sacred waters would nourish mortal bodies for mortal days, and all the wisdom Enki had given him would live on only if he could find ways to pass it to others before his time ran out. This is the central tragedy of the Adapa myth, if tragedy is indeed the right word for it. The story of a man who knew everything except the one thing that mattered, who trusted his teacher so completely that he refused the gift of eternal life, and who returned to earth carrying divine wisdom in a mortal vessel that would one day break and spill that wisdom into the darkness of death. And yet we must ask ourselves whether this is truly a tragedy or whether it is something else entirely. For Adapa lived out his remaining years in Eridu, and he taught what he knew to others, and those others taught their students, and the wisdom passed down through generations until it became the foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. Perhaps Enki knew exactly what he was doing when he warned Adapa to refuse the bread and water of heaven, for perhaps he understood that immortality would have been a prison rather than a gift trapping Adapa forever in the service of heaven, while the earth below went on without the guidance of its first and greatest sage. Perhaps the real gift was not the wide understanding or the knowledge of the design of heaven and earth, but the mortality that gave that knowledge weight and urgency, and meaning the mortality that forced Adapa to teach what he knew before his time ran out, and thus to create a tradition of wisdom that would outlast any individual life. We cannot know what Enki intended for. The tablets are silent on this point, and the mind of a god is not easily fathomed by mortal comprehension. But we can see what came after, and what came after was a civilization built on the foundation of what Adapa learned and taught, a civilization whose achievements still echo in our world today. And so, the one who knew everything knew not the one thing that mattered. He would die, and in that not knowing, perhaps in that human limitation, lies the secret that Enki really taught. The secret that wisdom is not diminished by mortality, but fulfilled by it, and that the greatest sages are not those who live forever, but those who use their brief, bright days to light the way for those who will come after. Now we descend into the heart of the mystery, into the still waters where Enki's true gifts to Adapa become clear, and to understand what the god of wisdom truly taught his mortal student, we must first examine a phrase that appears in the ancient tablets, a phrase rendered in Akkadian as Uznu Rapashtu, which scholars translate as wide understanding or broad ear. And this phrase alone opens doorways into the Mesopotamian conception of knowledge itself, for in that ancient world, the ear was the organ of wisdom, not the eye, not the mind as we might think of it, but the ear, the receiver of spoken truth, the vessel into which the words of the gods could be poured. And when the texts tell us that Enki opened the ear of Adapa, or that he gave him wide understanding, they are describing something far more profound than the simple transmission of facts. They are describing an initiation, a fundamental transformation of the human capacity to perceive and comprehend reality. An ear-opening ceremony that would echo through Mesopotamian culture for thousands of years in the training of scribes and priests who underwent similar rituals to prepare them for sacred knowledge. And so we must ask ourselves, what did this wide understanding actually contain? What were the specific teachings that flowed from the god of the deep waters into the waiting consciousness of the sage of Eridu? And here the texts and the archaeological record together paint a picture of astonishing breadth. For Enki's wisdom was not one secret whispered in darkness, but an entire curriculum of divine knowledge, a complete education in the workings of heaven and earth that would have included first and foremost the arts of divination, the reading of signs and omens through which the will of the gods could be discerned, from the examination of the livers of sacrificed sheep to the observation of oil spreading on water, from the flight patterns of birds to the movements of the stars across the night sky. All of these were channels of communication between the divine and human realms, and Adapa would have learned to read them all, to see meaning where others saw only randomness, to perceive the messages encoded in everyday phenomena by gods who were constantly speaking to those with ears to hear. And alongside divination came the arts of incantation, the sacred words and ritual formulas through which the knowledgeable priest could influence the unseen forces that shaped human destiny, words of protection against demons, words of healing for the sick, words of purification for those contaminated by contact with death or pollution, words that could bind and loose, summon and banish, words that carried power because they were the very words the gods themselves had spoken at the beginning of time. And, beyond these spiritual arts, the wide understanding encompassed practical wisdom as well, knowledge of agriculture and irrigation, of the proper times for planting and harvest, of how to read the rivers and predict the floods that could bring either abundance or devastation, knowledge of medicine and the properties of plants, of construction and the building of temples that would please the gods, of metallurgy and the working of copper and bronze, of weaving and pottery and all the crafts that distinguished civilized humanity from the beasts of the field. And we can see this vast curriculum reflected in the later scribal schools of Babylon and Assyria, where young men spent years mastering cuneiform writing and through it gaining access to the accumulated wisdom of centuries, copying tablets that contained everything from mathematical tables to mythological narratives, from legal codes to astronomical observations, from medical recipes to magical formulas. And all of this traced its ultimate origin to the primordial teachings that Enki had given to humanity through Adapa, the first sage, the prototype of all learned men who would follow. Let us go deeper still into the design of heaven and earth, for this phrase appears in the texts as one of the specific gifts Enki bestowed upon his student, and it speaks to a fundamental aspect of Mesopotamian thought, the belief that the universe was not chaotic but ordered, that beneath the apparent confusion of daily existence lay a structure, a pattern, a design that the wise could learn to perceive and understand. And this cosmic architecture was conceived in terms that might seem strange to modern minds, yet possessed their own profound logic, with heaven above where the great gods dwelt in their celestial courts, and earth below where humanity lived out its brief span, and beneath the earth the realm of the dead, the land of no return where all mortals eventually descended. And beneath even that, the Abzu, the underground ocean of sweet water that was Enki's own domain, the source of all springs and rivers, the deep that had existed before creation itself. And these realms were not separate and isolated, but connected, interpenetrating, with channels of influence flowing between them. And to know the design was to understand these connections, to perceive how an action in one realm could ripple through the others, how the movements of stars in heaven could mirror events on earth, how the proper performance of ritual could open pathways between worlds, how the underground waters could be summoned to rise through the earth and bring fertility to the fields. And at the center of this cosmic architecture stood the temple, the great ziggurats and sanctuaries that rose in every Mesopotamian city. And these were not merely buildings, but models of the universe itself, sacred mountains that connected earth to heaven, places where the boundaries between realms grew thin and humans could approach the divine. And Enki's temple at Eridu, the Iabzu, or House of the Abzu, was conceived as resting directly upon those primordial waters, a place where the god of wisdom could emerge from his watery depths to meet with those who sought his blessing. And to know the design of heaven and earth was also to understand the Me, those divine powers or cosmic principles that Enki guarded in his underwater sanctuary. The Me were the fundamental building blocks of civilized existence, numbering in the hundreds according to some texts, including such diverse elements as kingship and priesthood, truth and falsehood, the descent to the underworld and the ascent from the underworld, the art of the scribe and the art of the musician, the craft of the carpenter and the craft of the smith, sexual intercourse and prostitution, the kindling of fire and the extinguishing of fire, weariness and the restoration of strength. And the list goes on, a comprehensive catalogue of everything that makes human society possible. And Enki was the keeper of these powers, the god who could grant or withhold them. And in teaching Adapa the design of heaven and earth, he was revealing how all these elements fit together, how the cosmic order sustained the social order, how the proper performance of ritual maintained the harmony between gods and humans that kept the world functioning. And there is another aspect of this teaching that deserves special attention. For in Mesopotamian thought, to know something truly was to know its name, and to know the name of something was to have a kind of power over it. The very act of naming was a creative act, a defining act, an act that fixed the nature and place of the thing named in the cosmic order. And the gods had named everything at the beginning, calling each element of creation into existence by speaking its name. And the wise person who knew these names shared something of this divine power, could call upon things by their true names and thereby influence them, could speak the names of demons to bind them, could invoke the names of gods to summon their aid, could recite the names of sacred places and sacred times to activate their potency. And this knowledge of names was central to what Enki taught Adapa, a verbal map of reality that gave its possessor access to forces hidden from ordinary humanity. And if we allow ourselves to imagine the experience of this knowledge, to truly feel what it might have meant to possess such understanding, we can picture Adapa looking up at the night sky and seeing not random points of light, but a vast text written by the gods, constellations whose movements traced out messages of fate and fortune, planets whose positions revealed the intentions of the deities who guided them, the patterns that repeated in cycles of days and months and years and centuries, all part of one immense design that stretched from the deepest waters to the highest heavens, and that he alone among mortals could truly read. Now let us turn to the magical arts specifically. For Enki was above all the master of incantation, the lord of the sacred word, the god to whom priests and exorcists appealed when they required supernatural power to heal the sick or protect the vulnerable. And what he taught Adapa in this domain was nothing less than the technology of spiritual intervention, the methods by which a properly trained human being could interact with the invisible forces that surrounded and interpenetrated the visible world. And to understand this, we must set aside modern assumptions about the nature of magic and enter into the Mesopotamian worldview, where the boundaries we draw between religion and magic, between science and superstition, simply did not exist, where all knowledge was ultimately divine knowledge and all effective action required engagement with supernatural powers. And in this context, the figure of the Ashipu, the exorcist or incantation priest, emerges as one of the most important inheritors of Adapa's wisdom, trained in the sacred formulas that could identify and expel the demons responsible for disease and misfortune, armed with the ritual knowledge necessary to purify contaminated persons and places, skilled in the preparation of amulets and the performance of protective ceremonies that could shield individuals and households from malevolent forces. And alongside the Ashipu worked the Baru, the diviner whose specialty was reading the omens through which the gods communicated their intentions, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, or the patterns of oil and water, or the flights of birds, or the appearances of unusual phenomena, interpreting these signs according to vast compendia of omen literature that recorded thousands upon thousands of observed correlations between signs and their meanings. And both of these professional classes traced their knowledge back through chains of teachers and students to the original teachings of Enki, preserved in sacred tablets that were themselves objects of veneration, copied and recopied through generations with meticulous care because they contained the very words of divine power. And the specific techniques taught in this tradition were remarkably sophisticated, beginning with diagnosis, the identification of which demon or which angry god was responsible for a particular affliction, proceeding through prescription, the selection of the appropriate incantation and ritual to address the specific cause, and culminating in performance, the careful execution of the ceremony with its precise words and gestures and material elements, its burning of incense and sprinkling of water and manipulation of figurines that represented the demonic forces being bound or expelled, and through it all ran the power of the spoken word. The belief that certain combinations of sounds in certain sequences, pronounced in certain contexts, could actually alter reality, could compel demons to release their victims, could summon divine protection, could activate the healing properties of medicines, could transform ordinary water into an agent of purification. And this was not mere superstition, but a coherent system of thought in which language itself was understood as having been created by the gods, and therefore participating in divine power, in which the names of things were not arbitrary labels, but essential aspects of their nature, in which the recitation of a mythological narrative could reenact and reactivate the events it described, bringing primordial creative power into the present moment. And the tablets that survive from ancient libraries give us extensive examples of these incantations, prayers, and formulas of great beauty and power that address demons by name, that recount the mythological origins of diseases, that invoke the aid of Enki and other benevolent deities, that describe the ritual actions accompanying the words, that promise healing and protection to those for whom they are performed. And all of this was part of what Enki gave to Adapa, not mere information, but transformative knowledge that changed what was possible for the one who possessed it. The fourth great domain of Enki's teaching concerns time itself, the sacred calendar that structured Mesopotamian religious and social life. For in that world, time was not the uniform neutral medium we tend to imagine, but a living rhythm pulsing with divine significance, each day and month and season possessing its own character, its own appropriate activities, its own opportunities and dangers. And to know the calendar was to know when the gods were accessible and when they withdrew, when to plant and when to harvest, when to conduct business and when to remain at home, when to celebrate with feasting and when to observe solemnity and mourning. And this knowledge was essential to Adapa's role as the sage and priest of Eridu. For his daily duties included the preparation and presentation of offerings to Enki at the proper times, the baking of bread and pouring of libations according to schedules established since the beginning of time, the maintenance of the ritual cycle that kept the god favorably disposed toward his city and its people. And these were not arbitrary routines, but reflections of cosmic order, synchronized with the movements of the moon that marked out the months, with the rising and setting of key stars that signaled seasonal transitions, with the agricultural cycle of flood and planting and growth and harvest that sustained all life in the land between the rivers. And embedded within this larger calendar were specific days of special significance, new moons and full moons, when the gods were particularly attentive, seasonal festivals when great rituals renewed the bonds between heaven and earth, days of ill omen when dangerous demons were abroad and wise persons stayed indoors and avoided new enterprises, and, beyond the regular calendar, the reading of omens provided a kind of supplementary guidance, revealing through signs in sky and earth and everyday life the particular divine messages relevant to particular moments, so that the truly wise person navigated through time with a sensitivity to its varying textures, understanding that some moments were auspicious for certain actions and others were not, that the gods were not always equally present or equally responsive, that success depended not only on what one did, but on when one did it. And we can imagine Adapa in Eridu watching the moon wax and wane, noting the first visible crescent that marked the beginning of each new month, observing the stars that rose at sunset in each season, reading the signs that appeared in dreams and chance encounters. I am maintaining the rhythm of temple service that had been established when the world was young, and in this disciplined attention to sacred time, he embodied the knowledge Enki had given him, participating consciously in the cosmic order that most humans experienced only unconsciously, aware of the design of heaven and earth as it unfolded through the cycles of days and seasons and years, connected to patterns that stretched back to creation and forward to an endless future, knowing that even his mortal span was part of something much larger, one small segment of an eternal rhythm in which generations rose and fell like waves upon the sea, while the underlying order remained unchanged. And there is something deeply restful in this vision of time, something that connects us across the millennia to those ancient priests keeping their midnight vigils, watching the same moon and stars that we see tonight, performing their rituals with the faith that they were participating in something far greater than themselves. And now we come at last to the deepest teaching, the one that may not have been taught explicitly, but that pervades the entire myth and gives it its profound significance. And this is the wisdom of mortality itself, the understanding that Adapa received, not despite his exclusion from immortality, but through it. And here we must return to the central paradox of the story, the question that has puzzled readers for over a century since the tablets were first translated. Why did Enki warn Adapa against the bread and water of life? Was the god deceiving his student, withholding from him the supreme gift of eternal existence? Or was something else happening? Something that requires us to think more carefully about what immortality meant in the Mesopotamian worldview. And here, scholarship offers several interpretations, each with its own merits. Some suggest that Enki was indeed acting to protect humanity's interests against other gods who might have wanted to trap Adapa in divine servitude. For in some texts, the food of the gods binds those who eat it to eternal labor in heaven. And perhaps Enki foresaw that his beloved student would have been condemned to serve forever as a minor deity, cut off from earth and from his descendants, frozen in an unchanging existence, far from the waters and reeds of Eridu he loved. And from this perspective, Enki's warning was a gift disguised as a prohibition, a way of ensuring that Adapa would return to earth, where he could fulfill his true purpose as a teacher of humanity. And others point to the broader Mesopotamian understanding of death, which, while not a happy prospect, was accepted as the universal and unalterable condition of human existence, the very thing that defined humanity as distinct from the gods. And in the great epic of Gilgamesh, we see this lesson driven home with tremendous emotional power as the hero who has sought immortality throughout the tale finally learns from the sage Utnapishtim that death cannot be escaped, that the gods have reserved eternal life for themselves alone, that the proper response to mortality is not desperate resistance, but acceptance and the enjoyment of what life offers while it lasts. Anand Adapa's story can be read as an earlier version of the same profound teaching, demonstrating that even the wisest of men, even one who possessed the design of heaven and earth, even the student of Enki himself, could not and perhaps should not transcend the mortal condition. And this reading opens onto philosophical depths that resonate with wisdom traditions across cultures and centuries. The insight that acceptance of limitation is itself the highest wisdom, that the desire for immortality reflects a misunderstanding of what makes life meaningful, that our finitude is not a punishment or a deprivation, but the very condition that gives urgency and beauty and significance to our brief existence. And we might go further still and suggest that Enki's final gift to Adapa was precisely this lesson, that by arranging for his student to refuse immortality, he was completing his education in the most important truth of all, the truth that knowing everything is not the same as needing everything, that wisdom includes knowing what not to grasp for, that the sage fulfills his purpose not by living forever, but by passing his knowledge to others who will continue the chain after he is gone. And in this light, Adapa's return to earth is not a tragedy, but a triumph. He comes back to Eridu bearing all that Enki taught him, destined to teach others, to establish traditions that will outlast any individual life, to participate in the immortality of wisdom passed from generation to generation, rather than the static immortality of a single existence prolonged forever. And perhaps this is what Enki really taught Adapa in secret. Not any single piece of knowledge, but this complete vision of what it means to be wise, to know deeply while accepting the limits of knowledge, to serve faithfully while accepting that service will end, to love life while accepting that life will pass, to hold the design of heaven and earth in one's understanding while remaining rooted in the particular patch of earth where one was born. And in this teaching, there is something that speaks to us still, something that the clay tablets preserved through millennia, precisely because it addresses the permanent human situation. And as we sit with this ancient story, we might find ourselves touched by the same truth that Adapa discovered, that wisdom is not the accumulation of information, but a way of being in the world, a relationship with mystery that is not diminished by what it cannot grasp, yet a peace that comes from knowing one's place in the vast design without needing to be more than what one is. And this is perhaps Enki's greatest gift, given not only to Adapa, but through him to all of us who inherit the tradition of seeking wisdom while remaining mortal, who look up at the same stars and wonder about the same questions, who keep our own vigils and perform our own rituals, and pass on what we have learned to those who come after, participating in the endless conversation between heaven and earth that the god of the deep waters began so long ago in the temple at Eridu. Adapa was never alone in the tradition of sacred wisdom, for the Mesopotamians remembered not one sage, but 7, the Apkallu, the beings of extraordinary knowledge who walked the earth before the great flood and who carried the arts of civilization from the gods to humanity. Adapa stood first among them, the prototype, the model upon which all others were patterned, and in the centuries that followed his story, the scribes of Babylon and Assyria compiled lists that preserved their names and their deeds alongside the names of the ancient kings they served. These sage lists, inscribed on clay tablets that survive to this day, speak of figures who were part human and part divine, beings robed in the skin of fish who emerged from the waters of the Abzu to teach humanity the crafts that separate civilization from chaos. In the great palaces of the Assyrian kings, particularly in the halls of Nimrud and Nineveh, massive stone reliefs depicted these Apkallu figures standing guard at doorways and thresholds, their fish cloaks rendered in careful detail, their hands raised in gestures of blessing and protection, their presence a visible reminder that wisdom must be guarded and transmitted across the generations. The tradition held that each of the 7 sages had served a king of the antediluvian age, and that together they had established the foundations of all knowledge, from the reading of omens to the building of temples, from the treatment of illness to the proper worship of the gods. When the flood came, sweeping away the old world, the wisdom of the sages did not perish, but was passed on, preserved in the sacred traditions of the temples, copied and recopied by scribes who understood themselves to be links in a chain stretching back to the beginning of things. Adapa thus became more than a character in a single story. He became an archetype, a symbol of what a human being could achieve when touched by divine knowledge. And his example shaped the ideal of the wise counselor who stands beside the throne, offering guidance rooted in understanding of both heaven and earth. The patterns of this story, this transmission of sacred knowledge from divine beings to chosen mortals, this tragic limitation that accompanies the gift. These patterns did not remain confined to Mesopotamia, but echoed across the ancient world in ways that scholars have long studied and debated. Consider the story preserved in the Hebrew Scriptures, the account of a garden planted in the east, of a tree whose fruit conferred knowledge, and another tree whose fruit granted eternal life, of a choice made and a consequence suffered, of wisdom gained and immortality lost. The resonances between the Adapa myth and the Eden narrative have fascinated researchers for over a century. Since the cuneiform tablets were first deciphered and the parallels became visible, both stories concern the acquisition of knowledge that sets the protagonist apart. Both involve a test or temptation related to food. Both result in the permanent loss of immortality for humankind. And both seem to suggest that there is something incompatible between full knowledge and endless life. Scholars approach these connections with appropriate caution, noting that the stories differ in crucial ways. Thus, that the Hebrew narrative carries its own distinct theological concerns, that direct borrowing is difficult to prove even when influence seems probable, and that parallel development from common human concerns remains a possibility. What seems clear is that both traditions grappled with the same fundamental questions about the nature and limits of human existence. Similar patterns appear in the Greek tradition, where Prometheus stole fire from the gods to give to humanity and suffered eternal punishment for his transgression. Another tale of forbidden knowledge passed from the divine realm to mortals. Another narrative in which the gift comes with a price. The figure of the culture hero who teaches humanity the arts of civilization, who mediates between gods and mortals, who sometimes suffers for his generosity. This figure appears in traditions around the world, suggesting that the story of Adapa touches on something universal in human experience. The sense that our knowledge is a gift and a burden, that we have received more than we fully understand, that somewhere in the deep past a transaction occurred whose terms still bind us. These stories persist because they address questions that do not go away with the passage of centuries or the advance of technology. We still wonder about the nature of consciousness and its limits, about why we can imagine immortality but cannot achieve it, about whether our knowledge is a blessing or a curse, about what we might have lost in order to gain what we have. The tablets that carry the Adapa myth to us across 4,000 years were themselves lost for most of that time, are buried in the ruins of cities that fell to conquest and time, waiting in the darkness of the earth for someone to find them and learn to read their wedge-shaped signs. The first fragments came to light in the 1880s among the thousands of tablets discovered in the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. That great collection of ancient learning that had been assembled in the 7th century before the Common Era, and that lay undisturbed beneath the sands of northern Iraq until European archaeologists began their excavations. Other pieces of the Adapa story emerged from unexpected places, including a fragment found at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, the site of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten's capital, evidence that the story had circulated widely across the ancient Near East as a piece of scribal training literature. Additional fragments surfaced from Ashur and from other sites, each one adding details to a picture that remains incomplete. The tablets are damaged, broken, worn by time. Portions of the story are lost and may never be recovered. We read the myth through gaps and across silences, reconstructing what we can, acknowledging what we cannot know. This is the nature of our encounter with the ancient world, fragmentary yet precious, always partial yet somehow sufficient to convey meaning across the millennia. The scholars who work with these texts, the Assyriologists who have devoted their careers to learning Sumerian and Akkadian, to mastering the complexities of cuneiform script, to piecing together broken tablets and debating interpretations, they are themselves links in the chain of transmission that began with the ancient scribes. The discipline is small, the work painstaking, the rewards often invisible to the wider world. Yet it is through their efforts that voices silenced for thousands of years speak again. Every translation is an interpretation, every reading a negotiation between ancient meaning and modern understanding. Every edition of a text like the Adapa myth, a collaborative achievement spanning centuries. The work continues because the stories matter. They matter because they are ours in the deepest sense, not the possession of any single culture, but part of the common inheritance of humanity. Early attempts to answer questions we still ask, first formulations of problems we still face. When we read that Enki gave Adapa wide understanding, but not eternal life, we recognize something true about our own condition. When we watch Adapa refuse the bread of life, not knowing what he refuses, we feel the weight of choices made in ignorance. When we see him return to earth, wise but mortal, we see ourselves. The tablets speak today because the human heart has not changed, because the mystery of consciousness meeting its limits remains as vivid now as it was in the reed huts of Eridu. Something was given to us, some capacity for understanding that sets us apart, some fire stolen or bread shared or fruit eaten that made us what we are, and we live with the consequences of that gift, building our civilizations, asking our questions, passing what we know to those who come after, knowing that we too will pass. The Adapa myth does not resolve these mysteries. It simply holds them, gives them shape, passes them on. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the function of such stories is not to answer, but to accompany, to assure us that others have wondered what we wonder, have faced what we face, have carried the same beautiful burden of knowing just enough to know that we do not know everything. From the marshlands of ancient Sumer to the quiet rooms where scholars bend over photographs of damaged tablets, from the libraries of Nineveh to the museums of London and Philadelphia and Baghdad where the originals now rest. From the first scribe who pressed reed into wet clay to the listener hearing these words now, the chain of transmission holds. Wisdom flows like water, finding its way from source to sea, from deep to deep. What Enki taught Adapa, Adapa taught to those who came after, and they to their children, and so on through flood and empire, and catastrophe and recovery, until the words reach you now in this quiet moment. You are part of the story. You have received something from the depths, some portion of the wide understanding, some glimpse of the design of heaven and earth. What you do with it, how you carry it, to whom you pass it on, these are your choices to make. The ancient myth offers no instructions, only a mirror. Look into it. See yourself. See the sage who knew everything except how not to die. See the God who gave everything except the one thing that would have changed everything. See the bread of life offered and refused. And then look up from the mirror, back at your own life, your own knowledge, your own mortality. The tablets have spoken. The rest is yours. And so we return to where all things begin, and where all things eventually flow back, to the waters beneath the world, and to the Abzu, where Enki still dwells in the eternal deep, keeper of wisdom, guardian of the sweet waters that rise through springs and wells to nourish the land above. The cycle continues as it always has, rain falling from the heavens to feed the rivers, rivers winding their slow way to the sea surrendering its waters to the underground depths, and the underground depths giving rise once more to the springs that feed the marshes where reeds still whisper their ancient songs. This is what the myth of Adapa teaches us when we sit with it long enough, when we let its meanings settle into us like water seeping into earth. Knowledge is both gift and burden, a light that illuminates and a weight that must be carried. To know the design of heaven and earth is to see the patterns that others cannot see, to understand the connections that bind all things together. And yet, this knowing does not free us from our mortal condition, but rather deepens our awareness of it. Perhaps this is the final teaching that Enki gave to Adapa, not through words, but through the very structure of the gift itself, that wisdom means accepting what we are, that understanding means making peace with our limitations, that the deepest knowledge is knowing how much we cannot know. We are all children of Adapa in this way, inheritors of a partial understanding, bearers of a fragment of the wide awareness that flows from the deep. The temples of Eridu have long since crumbled back into the earth from which their bricks were made. The priests who once baked bread for the offerings have returned to dust. The hymns that once rose in the night have faded into silence. And yet, somewhere beneath the marshes, beneath the ruins, beneath the accumulated weight of centuries, the water still flows in its ancient courses, carrying within it the memory of all that has been. The tablets have spoken their truth across 4,000 years of silence. The clay has remembered what human memory forgot. And you who have listened, you who have traveled this long way through the story of gods and sages and the wisdom that passes between worlds, you carry now what Adapa carried, a portion of understanding, a glimpse of the design, a knowing that is incomplete and therefore human and therefore precious. Let it rest within you. Let it settle like silt in still water. Let it become part of you as you drift now toward sleep, toward dreams, and toward the deep waters of your own unconscious, where perhaps Enki still whispers his secrets to those who know how to listen. The story ends, as all stories do, returning to its source, flowing back to the beginning, to water, to wisdom, to the endless space between knowing and being, where we make our brief and beautiful home.